Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Yet another G7 summit. Yet another time, some of the richest democracies of the world come together on a common platform to discuss pressing issues concerning everyone globally. What did this grouping, composed primarily of rich states on either side of the Atlantic, achieve in the latest summit in France that also included the odd Asian member of Japan and invitees like India? Hi, I'm Lokendra Sharma, a tech geopolitics researcher with Takshashila. To discuss the takeaways from the G7 summit, I have with me Anushka Saxena, a China researcher, part of Takshashila's geostrategy program, and who has closely followed the G7 summit and the resulting statements and declarations. Welcome, Anushka.
Thank you so much for having me, Lokendra.
So, Anushka, before we go into the specifics of the recent G7 summit, can you help our listeners in understanding the global context in which the summit took place? That is to say, why is this G7 summit significant given the developments we see happening in West Asia, the war with Iran, then there's an ongoing war, it's been mentioned. Russia-Ukraine one, then there's so much happening on the tech front, supply chains, and beyond. So can you just set some context?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Lokendra. So, as many of our listeners would know, the 2026 summit, and I think I'll be butchering the French here, but the Evian summit, if I may say so, was different in a lot of ways than perhaps what we've seen come out of any such G7 leaders summits in the past 4 or 5 years, right? And as you mentioned, of course, for the longest time, the G7 has been looked at as the steering committee of these rich democracies, right? And yet more often than not, there's been that element of debate and deliberation that is its relevance being overtaken by the G20 or BRICS or some other organization that you'd want to pit against this group of highly powerful countries, right? So I guess the current moment and the conclusions from the Evian summit give us both fuel for the debate and as well as some assurance that it is still able to function with some sense of functional, cohesion, if I may say so, right? So, again, something that you alluded to, we have to first look at the context in which this summit took place. Of course, there is the 10-day war, which is now a 4-year war between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And of course, the leaders at the summit themselves called the war or rather the state that it is in today a new momentum, or the battlefield of the Russia-Ukraine war having gathered new momentum. So they're definitely sensing some, changes in how war is being fought by both sides. Air defenses are different today. The conclusions that perhaps somebody in 2022 could have drawn easily on holding of territory are different. So this new momentum, the articulation itself speaks to some anxieties that G7 leaders may have about what they see to be the future of the conflict, in that it could likely be quite prolonged. The other is, of course, the US-Israel-Iran war itself. And again, contrary to what some capitals in the G7 may have believed, the US and Iran are now on the table. There is a memorandum of understanding and the Strait of Hormuz is opened. Of course, again, the costs that had to be paid for oil, for energy, and broadly on diplomatic fronts by the G7 are the costs of including the US, right? So that again brings in a different kind of a context and angle. And then there's, of course, Beijing's sustained aggression, especially on the technological and geo-economic front. We just saw in April that Beijing promulgated 3 regulations, decrees number 834, 835, and 837, which talk about extending long-arm jurisdiction against foreign sanctions, going after any firm or company that complies with sanctions, applied on China and its operations by the US or Europe. So that new dynamic is shaping up, and China is more or with greater momentum depicting its willingness to weaponize supply chains, right? And then there's, of course, G7's own internal fault lines. There is not just linguistic, but also broader, I don't know, structural and value based differentiation that's happening now in how some G7 countries see the Indo Pacific versus how the US sees them. What kind of a threat perception some G7 countries have vis a vis China versus what the US has, right? And we can get into that going forward. Even on tariffs, you talked about this being a transatlantic partnership more than anything else, with, of course, other participants.
Japan is the only Pacific or an Asian country there.
So from around the from one or two around the region, right? If you look at G7 plus, where you had some others like India or Brazil or South Africa invited as well. So just in the spirit of thinking about cohesion within the transatlantic itself, till just a few months ago, the Europeans were fighting with the Americans to the point that they were about to activate their anti-coercion instrument against another G7 party. So those internal kind of fault lines continue to exist. And in that sense, I think what we can appreciate is that if we look at the outcomes of the 2025 summit, which was in Kananaskis, the fact that it ended without a communique, and this time it concluded with as many as 9 agreements, which you alluded to, is again kind of a sign that, okay, they can have some functional cohesion, and it will only happen where there is maximum agreement on maybe the underlying threats and the challenges, and where there are differences, like say the stuff on Indo-Pacific, the language and the sentiment will resort to the lowest common denominator, right? But so in that sense, I think the 2026 summit definitely went better than what we saw in 2025. And just another dimension, and I'll conclude here in the spirit of context setting, if we look at the identity of the G7 itself, it has gone from maybe contributing to 60% of the global economy or GDP, however you'd want to assess it, 60% approximately in 1975 to 29% today. So, and
is 29%
of the global GDP.
Nominal or PPP?
I'm not sure.
I think nominal it would be slightly more. Maybe PPP should be around, we can check the data.
35%.
Yeah. But the larger trend that it would have gone down, I think, with China's rise, India's rise, and the rise of a bunch of other countries in Asia, definitely that would have gone down.
Yeah, totally. I mean, if you look at the capture of, global economic decision making, there's a lot more actors now than just the G7.
Yeah.
So it's another place where it is going to find difficult to hold on to that identity as a steerer would be steering of the global economy in one particular direction that benefits it the most. And of course, now I'm talking G7 as a whole and not just the US, because of course the US remains the most powerful economy, has a lot of say in how geoeconomics functions. But the point is that now the bloc is hedging against itself by expanding on to bring other actors within conversations, right? We'll discuss the critical minerals declaration further, but you see them bringing Australia onto it because you need partners that extend beyond this secluded group of countries. You have them trying to replicate Japanese countermeasures to Chinese weaponization of critical mineral supply chains. And of course, you have them speaking with Brazil, South Africa, and India on other aspects of resilience, right? So I think a lot of that will become more evident as the G7 continues to operate in a very geopolitically crowded, world and moment. But you definitely see some sense of an acknowledgement in this summit that we alone are not enough.
Okay. Thanks, Anushka, for setting that wonderful, comprehensive context. So you mentioned about how this time there were so many agreements, and I think there were close to 9, right? And these were multiple statements and declarations they have put out covering so many different areas, like mutually beneficial international partnerships. Then there's something on the Ebola outbreak that's wreaking havoc in Africa right now. Then fight against cancer, which was an interesting inclusion. Then geopolitical issues, which are expected to be there. then tackling migrant smuggling, which I think across the Atlantic remains a priority issue right now with the polarization that's
Yeah.
happening. Fight against drug trafficking. I think this is something US might have pushed to be
Yeah.
included. Then safer digital space for minors, balanced, durable, and resilient growth. And finally, there was a declaration on securing supply chains for critical minerals. And this is something you also mentioned briefly. And I think we'll cover it later on in much more detail. So, among all these statements and declarations, what stood out for you?
Yeah. I mean, of course, each of them have their own values, right? I mean, if you just look at the mechanics of the Quad itself, there is so much complaint and debate about how the Quad is essentially defunct. And I'm just making a tangential point here, and I'll come back to your question in a minute. And yet, if you look at the 35 to 40 initiatives Quad has launched between 2017 and today, I think one of the most successful ones are those that pertain to health and then to vaccine distribution. Of course, the latter was catapulted by the COVID-19 pandemic and the exigencies that created. But the fact that one of their most successful initiatives is the Moonshot Cancer Vaccine Initiative just tells you that, look, public goods can be produced by groupings that essentially everyone would think are defunct. And look, broadly, this is not to discredit that perception, because you have to pit the achievements of a grouping against what their political objectives or their intended goals and targets are. So I guess in that sense, it makes sense that Quad hasn't delivered enough on the China challenge. Let's say that's one grievance folks would have, right? But and yet I would still argue for that grouping to continue to exist and go on, because of the other things that they've done well. So in the same spirit, I think the G7 agreements on the Ebola outbreak, which again is a pressing issue now, on digital safety for minors, all of these are crucial, at least from the perspective of the standards that these largely developed economies can set. And of course, then other countries can choose to adopt them or not. Or adapt to them, if I may say so. But I think, as to the question of which, I think the declaration that really stands out to me has to be the Declaration on Critical Minerals Resilience. Primarily because this is one of those rare instances when a grouping like the G7 has come together at a very tumultuous time to put numerical targets on the whiteboard, right? So
Yeah.
there are targets that pertain to achieving sub 60% dependency on a single non G7 supplier of
Yeah.
rare earths and permanent magnets by 2030, and the ambition actually is for 50%. And so this measurable de-risking outcome is really useful from the agreement's perspective, and it's not the vague resilience language that you hear everywhere, right?
And just sorry for intervening briefly.
No,
I
yeah.
was just looking at the language they've used. They're saying, and I quote, "We aim to significantly reduce our dependencies on a single supplier outside the G7 and partner countries for rare earths and permanent magnets to under 60% by 2030, unquote." And the way they have named China without naming
Yeah.
China, because only China has the kind of dominance that is close to 90% or something. And without naming
Absolutely.
it, they said they'll bring it down to 60 and below. So I think that's a good point you've made. They put a numerical target and also a deadline by which they want to do it.
Totally. And of course, yeah, I think it's funny. The only place that they actually named China in any of these agreements or declarations was when they were talking about another upcoming G7 event, which will be conducted with the participation of China. Aside from that, there was absolutely no mention of China, and yet there were concerns that were raised about China's actions in the Taiwan Strait and, of course, vis-a-vis critical minerals. So that's one. And then the other thing which I find really interesting and is also a numerical target but might run into some challenges is the 64 billion euro commitment to some 195 projects beginning 2026. And again, it has some empirical weight, but what it does is that it clubs three kind of measures under that one headline figure of 64 billion, right? One is equity participation, which of course is exemplified, for example, by the US Department of War stake in MP materials. So this puts capital on the company's, I don't know, balance sheet, but the company still has to go around hiring workers and investing in mining and so on and so forth, and resolving technical problems along the way. And then the second thing is offtake agreements, right? Where as a government you have a contract where you say that, look, I will definitely be a buyer and I'll procure your output at a specific price, right? So this, I'll say, is exemplified by again the Department of War saying that for 10 years we're going to buy neodymium, praseodymium for $110 per kg, right? So something like that. And then there is the commission tonnage, which is of course the operational output, and the 2030 target that they have will essentially depend on this, right? Because this output is the outcome that will determine the profitability and of course the serviceability of the G7's demand. So aside from those challenges, and we can get into them a little later, I think this stood out to me as a useful and one of the most interesting and agreements to kind of look forward to as well. Just one point on the statement on geopolitical issues, which quickly touches upon a lot of stuff: the war in West Asia, Ukraine, North Korea's nuclear proliferation, and of course issues in the Southeast China Seas as well as Taiwan. Right. The important thing to note here is what is missing. If you look at the conclusions of the 2024 summit, which I think happened in Apulia in Italy, if I'm not wrong, they promised $50 billion worth of sales in assets to Ukraine or support to Ukraine taken from Russia's frozen assets. Now, at the time, that was a landmark agreement, and some deliveries have happened from G7 countries on that front. This time, the language is really formulaic. It's about battlefield gaining a new momentum. We need to give more air defenses to Ukraine. We will extend licensing agreements of defense products so that Ukraine, can produce internally, so on and so forth, right? I mean, the real meat of something like this would be in actually seeing if Ukraine can produce that Patriot missile at home, right? And given the stresses on their defense industrial base, and given the fact that Europe is navigating its own rearmament program, which has its own loan risk problems, disparity between European countries related problems. I'll reiterate what I said. I find the phrasing very formulaic.
Sure.
And yet I think again the firm commitment to Ukraine staying intact is interesting. It's just no numerical commitment taken from Russia's frozen assets.
Thanks, Anushka. We'll move to some specific questions now, and I think you have covered them to some extent already. So we'll see what new we can add or what new ground we can cover on those fronts. And the first, so I wanted to essentially pivot from broad discussion about the context and what stood out for you towards specific questions around Ukraine, Indo-Pacific, and critical minerals. I think Ukraine and critical minerals you have addressed to some extent, but we'll see what else we can add to that. So let's start with the Indo-Pacific, right? Recently, the US Indo-Pacific Command, they reverted their name back to the Pacific Command. So they've taken a step back. That's one development. And then in the G7 statement, we see this commitment to free and open Indo-Pacific, which is quite spotlighted. So how do you see the G7 statement in light of what the US has been up to recently?
Yeah. Again, and this is something I alluded to when we were setting the context. I think this is one of those contexts where you revert to the lowest common denominator because there is internal divergence, right? And again, I don't want to speculate exactly why the US Indo-PACOM dropped the Indo from the name, but you can read the signs and get some signals, right? For example, like my favorite place to go for this is Pete Hegseth's speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue. If you look at the conversations he's having about China, to begin with, what he's essentially saying is, and by the way, this is a stark difference from Hegseth's 2025 speech, right? In 2025, Hegseth mentioned China or the Communist Party over 20 times. This time he mentions it just a few times, and to basically say that, look, US policy on China is changing. We are more clear-eyed now about the challenge we face vis-a-vis China. And so we are not going to engage in unnecessary confrontation. This is exactly the language Pete Hegseth uses. And no surprise, it happens after the Trump Xi summit in Beijing and in mid May. And then he says something to the tune of, all countries must fend for themselves. A taxpayer does not want to pay for the defense of Manila and Tokyo. You need to stop mooching off of that taxpayer. You need to give the US what it's worth. And so now that we're clear-eyed about China, and B, clear-eyed about the value of alliances, I think we're going to refrain now from going out of our way to build the Indo-Pacific that you all wanted, right? Which is essentially something with the US actively present there to hedge against China and to contain it to a great extent, right? So this is this, and of course, then again comparing 25 and 26 speeches from Pete Hegseth at SLD. No mention of South China Sea this time, no mention of East China Sea, no mention of Taiwan, as opposed to what we saw last year, which was very strong language opposing any unilateral changes to this, or opposing, for that matter, any actions from China, of course, that impact American interests. So broadly, the structural approach to Indo-Pacific also has changed in a year. And of course, then there's the India paragraphs in Hegseth's speech, which talk about how India is an actor that thinks in its self-interest. It's an important actor and it's a good friend, but it will do what it wants to do, essentially. So there's a little bit of that giving up kind of an articulation vis-a-vis India as well. And India, let's face it, is central to the framing of Indo-Pacific, right? So I think if this is the structural and systemic context in which the US is going to be operating starting this year, it's clearly going to be a problem for Japan or G7 plus partners like Australia, or even France and others that see Indo-Pacific as an important region and see actions in the Indo-Pacific as something meant to counter the unnamed China, right? So that's clearly a divergence. And yet, it's not surprising because since the beginning of Trump's tenure, we know that the US is going to bilateralize any issues with China. The US wants to take on China itself. Washington and Beijing are navigating their own game. And there's pretty much little to no room for alliances, at least at the broader strategic perspective. Operationally, of course, the US will continue to participate in semiconductor agreements and the Quad and other such places. But in terms of principles, I think the US can no longer be convinced by the idea that, look, you need France or you need Japan to have a coherent Indo-Pacific policy.
Thanks, Anushka. So I'll come to the Ukraine bit again now. And this time I want to pose a very specific question to you. Do you think that the G7 has agreed to anything substantial that will meaningfully change the course of the Russia-Ukraine war?
Yeah. This time around, I would say no, nothing substantive. Again, like I said, I think I saw 2-3 things in the geopolitical issues declaration, which is about increased delivery of air defense capabilities, additional systems like interceptors and long range, and consideration of extending licenses to allow for increased Ukrainian domestic military production. Now, are any of these new commitments? Not exactly, right? And even if you look at the detailed wording on the license extension, it is about ready to consider. So it's permissive rather than committal, right? And if you look at...
it was a very long sentence that could have been said in 2 words, but
I mean, it might happen, it might not. That's exactly what it says, right? So and individual G7 capitals will have their own approaches to this. Just look at Japan, right? I mean, I don't know if Japan's really thinking about Ukraine's ability to produce European or American missiles or the Leopold tank or the Patriot domestically, right? So I don't know if it wants to commit money to that end when it has its own militarization going on internally, and of course the China threat which it has to deal with, right? So different G7 capitals will look at it differently. If, Poland, for example, was at the table, it would have loved the idea, especially considering Poland, of all parties, is because Russia is right next door. It's spending one of the biggest amounts of monies across the transatlantic or across Europe, let's put it that way, to deal with the Russia challenge domestically. So it's nearly 5% of its GDP that's going in defense, which is unprecedented to say the least. But unfortunately, it's not on the table. So in that sense, I don't think this is as substantive as some of the previous agreements and languages that we have seen, like I mentioned.
Thanks, Anushka. So we'll move to the final bit of the podcast, which is around critical minerals, which I think, based on your responses, is one of the most important elements of the whole package of 9 things that have come out. So, I'll just briefly lay out what my understanding of critical minerals is. And I've been seeing a discussion around critical minerals for the last many years. It's not a new discussion because I remember analysts and researchers have been flagging China's dominance and increasing dominance in critical minerals for last many years now, because it was not built overnight. It was built over many, many years. And this definitely popped up in news articles and in research papers. But I did not necessarily see a corresponding action coming from Western capitals to do something about it. My sense is, West was very happy with China dabbling in a polluting enterprise, because, critical minerals is not a very great thing to do, as in it involves a lot of polluting stuff. And West was getting it for a very competitive, cheap price. So they were very happy. The cost was low. The pollution was, externalized in a way that they were not bearing the cost of it, the true cost of it. So it worked well for them. But last year, China finally weaponized that dominance by instituting globe spanning export controls that affected everyone, not just the West, but also India. Right. So, and that is when the West started taking critical mineral supply chain as a very priority issue. And a lot of developments happened on the Quad front also. Now in G7 also, they have this declaration on securing supply chains for critical minerals, right? So, and I know you have briefly touched upon some of the things, including that 64 billion euros figure also. So, can you tell us what are the highlights of this declaration? And is this declaration going to meaningfully again change how critical mineral supply chains is instituted globally?
Yeah. Thanks for that. And of course, as you rightly said, the weaponization and the geoeconomics around the supply chains of critical minerals seems to be something that has only become popularized and proliferated in the past 5 years. So I guess I would call this both timely and substantively meaningful for a declaration between G7 countries. Certainly not something that we've seen, even though, like you said, analysts have been talking about the challenges China's dominance faces. So we talked about the need to reduce dependency to ambitiously to 50% by 2030. We talked about the $64 billion euros and how it merges different types of commitments that governments can provide to their miners and their firms. They can range from equity to offtake to, of course, tonnage-based commitments. And they can run into some challenges, and it could potentially also provide the financial fuel firms need to invest in this polluting enterprise. Because, and I think our listeners would be very aware of this by now, it could take 16 to 18 years for a mine to
From conception to
yeah.
production.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, for a mind to yield outcomes and results, right? So, so I guess in that sense, the money, of course, matters. It always matters, right? And I'm sure, given the fact that the G7 in this declaration has said multiple times that they're going to expand the list, starting with rare earths and then moving on to permanent magnets and critical minerals, the broader critical minerals category, means that I think there will be some sustained financing if this doesn't fizzle out, right? Just to make a tangential point, we were discussing the declarations that were there, right? And the declaration that we did not see was something on AI governance, right? Even though the EU AI Act just got operational in August 2025. This is even though in 2023 at the Japan Leaders Summit, we had the Hiroshima AI process. It wasn't even talked about this time. So that fizzled out. Hopefully this won't. So in that sense, I think the 2-3 things, and I'll conclude by after talking about these, that I find meaningful and those that need work are these. One is that there is the commitment to stockpiling. That is very useful for me because Japan has massive experience with how stockpiling needs to be done, especially after the Senkaku Islands skirmish and the 2010 tensions with China. What stockpiling does is that it cannot solve the upstream supply chain weaponization and restriction problem, but it can, during a period of cool off, give the midstream supply chain a little bit of a boost, even as it prepares, maybe takes 6 months to a year to prepare for the shortcomings in the upstream, right? So stockpiling is an absolutely useful measure when
essentially it cushions you from the disruption for a temporary period of time.
It cushions you from a disruption.
And also serves your strategic industrial needs.
Totally.
But I think one thing that stood out for me was I was not expecting to see an emphasis on recycling also, because this is something that Takshashila has argued. Researchers here have pushed out, I think, a document on critical mineral recycling also. Because it's also a good way of getting hold of critical minerals, because a lot of that is already in the products that we use. And if we can, somehow recycle it and use it, that's it. Because again, as you said, mines take a lot of time.
Totally.
So we'll have to get our hands on as many sources as possible.
Totally.
So recycling is a good way forward. And they said, and this is the last line of that recycling paragraph, and I quote, "Our aim is to increase our collective recycling capacity capable of producing a significant share of the annual consumption of G7 members by the end of 2030, unquote. I think they've not given a specific number, but they do want to have significant proportion coming from recycling itself, which is an interesting bit.
Yeah, and for that to materialize is also equally important. Only problem is China has some weight in the recycling domain as well. So hopefully that can work out competitively over the next 5 years. Then, of course, there is the traceability pilot, which again is very interesting, and they intend to start off with lithium. Now, what that does, this combined with the Xinjiang origin restrictions, what that does is it inflames Beijing even further, because what you want to do is you want to know the origin of rare earths and critical minerals, and you want to make sure that across the supply chain, they both maintain their quality, their identity, and at the same time, the procurement supply chain is de-risked in a way. And traceability can be very complex for permanent magnets or other kinds of materials, because there are 10 different or 15 different stages, right? And you want to know where each of those took place. And of course, you don't want any of those to be China. So what you're looking is targeted action at each step: mining, refining, blending, manufacturing downstream components, so on and so forth, right? So for them to start off with lithium is good. And if they can build a framework out of it, they can probably scale it to others. And that could be a toolkit for the rest of the world. Finally, I think the one place that this agreement falls short, and I'll conclude with this, is price flooring and price ceiling, rather.
Okay.
The fact that in 2015 you had Molycorp, which was then an American firm that had taken a loan of approximately $1.5 billion to get their mine up and running and to get their output up and running. It tanked and it went out of business drastically, was because China flooded the market with really cheap, massively scaled critical minerals and rare earth materials. And that led to a crash in market price and took Molycorp out of business, right? We don't want something similar to happen to a firm that perhaps the G7 invested in. So there has to be an agreement also on how to fix, market pricing so that flooding does not become a problem again. Because, and this is something we often advocate at Takshashila, China is a market failure.
International market failure.
It's an international market failure, right? Why is it? One of the things that makes it an international market failure is the fact that many ignored the measures that it undertook internally to be able to subsidize costs and flood markets.
And the structural excess
Yeah.
capacity it has.
And the structural excess capacity that is a result of that,
Yeah.
right? Because involution or ruinous competition sits at the very basis. Or if you want to even go down to even further brass tacks, it's the fact that the Chinese economy is structurally export oriented and suppresses consumption, right? So if we don't want that same, and it's kind of too late now as well, but even in the future, if you want the G7 to be able to deliver on it, there has to be some sort of a consensus on pricing, which I don't think
So
we've...
on pricing, I'll just again give a quote. It's in the statement. Quote, we also continue to explore demand and supply side measures such as diversification requirements, revenue stabilization mechanisms, including price gap subsidies, joint procurement instruments, and trade related instruments such as quotas and price floors. Unquote. So they're saying that they will explore price floors, but I don't think they have instituted some mechanism. At least in this statement, I couldn't find any other mention of the flooring bit. So it seems it's on their radar, but maybe some measures may follow.
I'm sure. But if they can get that done, I'm sure it'll be much more substantive than it is now.
Thank you so much, Anushka, for taking us through the very different aspects of the G7 summit and the highlights and what stood out for you. And I think we discussed in the about 35 minutes of conversation that we have so far, we have covered critical minerals in fair detail. We have also touched on the Indo-Pacific bit, and we have touched on Ukraine. We have also put this summit in the global context and why it is relevant, why it is important. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. If you have any questions or thought, please feel free to reach out to us at Takshashila. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.